Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to WTM 2021. It's great to be back in person. I'm John Strickland and delighted to be hosting our big airline session. You'd think there might not be that much to talk about given the state of the industry for the last 2 years, but I think we've got a few things to keep you interested. And we have one guest virtually, one guest here in reality. So first of all, I'll let our virtual guest introduce himself. I've got no sound, that's helpful. Can we get some sound?
Yeah, good morning, John, and good morning to all your Zoom attenders here. It's good to speak to you all. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. We're on our results roadshow this week, so I have to go around and count for my actions with my shareholders for the next number of days. But we're with you in spirit, if not in person.
Great. We'll be hearing plenty more from Michael in due course. He's just announced a 48 million euro loss for the first half of this year, which sounds bad, but was a massive improvement on where it was this time last year. So first of all, let's give you a clue as to what kind of things we're going to be talking about. Of course, we're going to set the context of where we are today for the industry and what its outlook might be in the next few years for state of recovery. What does that mean in terms of the shape of future demand? What impact is it going to have on different airline business models? And last but not least, particularly in the week when we have the COP26 meeting going on in Glasgow, we have to comment on the environment. And once I've run through the slides, we'll have our live guest, Alex Cruz, who will be joining us here on stage for a debate and a deep dive on all of these issues and more. So context, it perhaps goes without saying, this is the biggest shock the industry has ever had. I mean, I've lived through the period of 9/11 and SARS and many other crises that have hit the airline business. I must admit at the time of 9/11, I thought that was probably the worst we could ever have. But this pandemic has really beaten all of them. It's just put all of them in the shade. You could add them together and it still wouldn't be as bad as this one. This chart from IATA shows how the challenge has now persisted for around about 20 months. We're heading rapidly towards 2 years and it hasn't left us yet. And just as we think we're getting on top of it, it throws us another unexpected twist. There is some good news, though, of course. A year ago, I would have been standing here if we'd had a WTM last year, talking about the need to find a vaccine, or we now have several different effective vaccines. They've been rolled out quite rapidly in a number of countries, which is not to say adequately enough, and that means we're in a much more protected state than we were before. But as they say, no one's safe until everyone is safe, and many countries around the world have had very limited rollout of vaccines so far, and even those we have are now giving questions about their impact and the effectiveness and how long it lasts. Waning of vaccines is taking place and the need for boosters. So it's a big help, but certainly we cannot let our guard down by any means. Let's ask Michael what his view is about the vaccine situation.
I mean, I think I think it would be wrong to be not rule out, recurrence of adverse COVID developments. I mean, I think we take significant comfort from the fact that in the UK and across Europe, vaccination rates are still very high. Typically 90% in Europe, a little bit lower in the UK. But that still leaves a reasonable size of the population unvaccinated, 10 and 15% of the population unvaccinated. And they're still at risk of, we would be we would be asking the government or pushing governments to be much more stringent about vaccinations. We're happy to see restrictions applied to non-vaccinated people, but we do believe that vaccinated people should be allowed to travel, go to pubs, clubs, nightclubs, restaurants without restriction. They are fully vaccinated, and there should be a reward for that vaccination. But I think we can't rule out further mismanagement of COVID, particularly by the Johnsonian government, which has mismanaged almost everything it's touched thus far. I would be more optimistic that Europe, there would be a more common sense approach. Europe has been tremendously successful, but with both the vaccination program and also with the digital COVID cert. But I think there will be bumps in the road this winter. It's inevitable. What we're really looking to, though, is building confidence among the travelling public for next Easter when the schools are off, and then obviously summer of 2022 when we hope to see a very strong recovery.
So some optimistic words there from Michael O'Leary. We'll hear more about how Ryanair is doing in the course of the next few minutes. Hopeful signs certainly are becoming more prevalent right now. For quite some time, we've seen strong performance in those countries in the world that have large domestic markets, for example, the US, Russia and China. In some cases, we've even seen volume of activity above pre-COVID levels, but sadly, not all parts of the world do have large domestic markets. Even as we speak today, Australia, which has been one of the most conservative in its treatment of the virus and been on almost permanent lockdown, is finally opening up with its first flights today to the UK and to the USA. That's really positive news. And perhaps more importantly, in this part of the world, for a number of the key airlines operating in Europe, such as British Airways, Virgin, Air France, KLM and Lufthansa, we're finally seeing some hope in the North Atlantic market. A couple of months ago, Europe did open its doors to double-vaccinated American citizens, and a week today, the US will open its doors once again to similarly double-vaccinated people traveling from the UK and from Europe. That's major good news for airlines, as I mentioned, like British Airways and Virgin, and we've seen again in this chart from IATA how the demand really spiked when those messages of reopening occurred. Back in September, the red line showing how Americans were jumping at the chance to travel. There really was pent-up demand. People couldn't wait to book, and airlines added additional capacity. Similarly, when it was announced that the US would open to inbound visitors, we saw another spike, the blue line, and massive bookings out of the UK and Europe to the US. So airlines adding a lot of capacity back in, and routes which have been suspended pretty well since the start of this pandemic have been brought back to life. If we look into next year, again, IATA is projecting further recovery. We're a long way off from total recovery. Nobody actually knows when it will be. Again, IATA predicts maybe around about 2024, we could be back to 2019 volumes. As for next year, where perhaps we have a little bit more clarity, it's Europe who is the main beneficiary again. The intra-European market, which has had a fairly successful summer in places, some of the beach destinations for markets like UK, Germany, and so on have had some decent volumes when people have been able to travel with confidence outside of restrictions such as quarantines and testing requirements. Long haul, as I mentioned, has been in the doldrums, but IATA predicts that Europe will be back to about 75% of pre-pandemic volumes next year. And similarly, North Atlantic, as we were just commenting, will be back to maybe 65% of pre-pandemic volumes as well. The big area of challenge still is Asia. Asia, arguably, which took us into the crisis, certainly with the virus emanating out of China, it remains the most locked up. So many important markets are not yet accessible to the world's long-haul airlines, and a major source of tourism, of course, in and out of Asia as well. So that one is certainly going to take some more work. The only bright spot perhaps being Singapore opening up to an extent in the last few weeks. So the level of demand is one thing, but the shape of demand is another. You know, what kind of demand are we actually going to see as we move forward? Well, the evidence so far is when people have been able to travel, people who want to go on holiday, people who want to visit friends and family, for those of you who don't know the acronym VFR, visiting friends and relations, those two flows have seen a really strong rebound in traffic. As I mentioned, pent-up demand, people want to go when they can, when flights are available and they can have the confidence to book them and know they're going to actually operate. The big question really is about business travel, particularly long-haul business travel. And when I say business travel, it needs a further definition. I mean business travel, traveling in the premium cabins, particularly, of course, in business class. That was a massive source of revenue and profitability for a number of airlines, particularly in the long-haul markets, of course, pre-pandemic. It just dried up, of course, with the pandemic, not least because companies put restrictions on their own employees traveling, and there's a great deal of doubt about how that will come back because, of course, many companies have learned just how easily they can conduct business over video conferencing, such as Zoom and Teams. The financial people in those companies have realized how much they can save in budget by not letting their executives travel. And if we factor in the environment consideration too, I'm convinced personally many companies are going to take that as an argument why they're not going to travel as much in the future, to show their green credentials by doing more online and less in person. That doesn't mean it's not going to come back, but I think there's going to be a significant dent in that flow of traffic with a consequent financial impact for those airlines who have relied on it. The saving grace could be a return or a development further of premium leisure traffic, with leisure travellers being willing to pay more for a bit of luxury, maybe being willing to pay more to have a bit more space and a sense of confidence in their travels. But typically those leisure travellers, perhaps occupying business class seats, are paying less than those corporate travellers before. So it could still leave a gap in the revenues of some companies. Let's take a look now at some of the business models and how they've been faring. Well, it's very fair to say the model that has performed best through this pandemic, as it has done through other crises, is the low-cost model. But within that, the three leaders in Europe have seen very different experiences. If we look at Ryanair and Wizz Air, they've both seen this crisis as a major opportunity, really adopting the mantra of why waste a good crisis. They have massive fleet orders in place. Ryanair in particular just reiterated this morning they have upgraded their growth forecast both for fleet and for passengers to have over 200 million passengers by 2026 and over 600 aircraft in their fleet. They're jumping at every opportunity they see where other airlines are cutting back, routes are being terminated, or indeed businesses are failing. And similarly, Wizz has a smaller fleet than Ryanair, but that's not to say in any way a small fleet. They're moving from about 130 or so aircraft now up to nearly 300 aircraft in the next 4 or 5 years. And their CEO, Joe Verardi, a previous guest at WTM, has said he sees Wizz as becoming an airline with more than 500 aircraft in the next few years. They've been mooted as a possible bidder to take over EasyJet. They've also indicated they might put in an additional order for extra Airbus orders. So these two are really exploiting the challenges faced by others. EasyJet, which is the second largest, ahead of Wizz in size at the moment, but has taken a much more cautious approach. They did have a number of shareholder challenges in the past where their founder shareholder, Stelios Hadjianou, was much more concerned about dividends, less about what he saw as value-destroying growth, and was pushing the airline to stop its rate of expansion. The crisis came along, and indeed some of his wish came true, and the airline didn't actually cancel orders particularly, they delayed some, but they've been shedding aircraft from the fleet. So we see on the chart that they showed investors recently here that their fleet has actually fallen in size, and while it will grow next year again, it will only be putting on a handful of aircraft relative to the other two competitors. As I mentioned, it has been the source of a takeover bid, and I think we may see that come back again. Another interesting slide here, just taking a snapshot from one day last week by Eurocontrol, we manage the air traffic control services here in Europe, showing the performance on one day of the major airline groups. And it mirrors what I've just been saying. Ryanair pretty well now operating at the same levels as it was pre-pandemic. Wizz actually ahead. EasyJet out of line amongst the low-cost carriers, down nearly 50%. And the network group carriers who rely on global long-haul traffic for the largest share of their business, all showing massive negative variances, with the exception of Turkish Airlines, who is down substantially less. They, perhaps in some ways like Ryanair, have been taking the chance to give people a taste of their product and have kept more services going. So naturally, it fell to me to ask Michael O'Leary, what did he think of low-cost carriers and competition in general?
And looking at the competition, a bit, just talking about the low-cost carriers, I'm interested to see the evolution that's been taking place recently.
There are other low-cost carriers, John.
Of course not, Mike, of course not. I mean, if I look at what's going on with Wizz Air and Joe Verardi's comments recently, much more bullish, talking about Wizz being a 500-plus aircraft airline, nothing confirmed, but possibly an additional order going in on whatever they've got. And not again confirmed that they seemingly would have been the bidder for EasyJet. They want to grow. I guess you guys are going to rub up against each other more frequently than you do. And then EasyJet, a different story, still much more cautious. You said yourself that I think last time we spoke, you don't see EasyJet remaining independent. And in fact, you believe if indeed they are bought, it would be more likely to be a network carrier. How do you look at those two companies?
I think, as I said, you kind of covered a raft of things. Joe talks his own book. I mean, generally, I think he talks a lot of rubbish. They have, they're clearly in trouble at the moment for I presume, crews, because they're cancelling routes and cancelling bases all over the place. But I presume that'll be reasonably short term. Their aircraft are very expensive. They've already kind of said that aircraft discussions with Airbus are taking place at the Indigo level, so the shareholder level. So I assume Wizz, if they expand the fleet, will continue to expand the fleet at very expensive prices. Ultimately, we don't run up against Wizz that often. They came into Norway, withdrew after 10 weeks. They have a small foothold in Italy, but they're going nowhere in a hurry. They've done well in Eastern Europe prior to Ryanair expanding rapidly in Eastern Europe, and they're down in Dubai and in some of those other markets. So I think not unlike EasyJet, they're looking for markets where they can expand, where they don't have to compete with Ryanair. Good, sensible strategy. EasyJet have gone ex-growth. They're not particularly low cost. They do have, an interesting presence there in expensive airports, expensive slot-blocked airports. So, they're just playing a kind of a cheaper Me Too to the incumbent carriers in Gatwick, in Paris, in Switzerland. Most of the airports where they compete with us, they're in gradual decline. They, withdrawing aircraft from Italy, from Portugal, where we're expanding rapidly. I've long been of the view, though, that Europe will, in the next 5 years, coalesce around 4 major airlines, not unlike North America. You have the Lufthansa family, the IAG BA family, the Air France KLM family, and Ryanair will be the low-cost carrier. I struggle to see how a second low-cost carrier or not so low-cost carrier will survive, because ultimately it won't be able to compete with Ryanair on efficiency or price or cost. But I do believe if you could somehow put maybe Wizz and EasyJet together, then strategically there might be a 5th carrier. It would just be 4 high-fare carriers and 1 low-fare carrier. But they are both Airbus operators. EasyJet has a reasonably well-defended position at certain high-cost airports in Western Europe. Wizz is in Eastern Europe. Neither of them want to compete with Ryanair. So you put the two together, it probably, would be, and would see them survive as an independent alternative. It's just they won't be very competitive against Ryanair, but they'll be very competitive against the legacy carriers. I still would be of the view, that I think EasyJet is more likely to get taken out by an IAG or an Air France KLM in the next number of years. I think IAG would covet EasyJet slots in places like Gatwick. Air France would sew up a monopoly again in Paris, Charles de Gaulle and Orly if they took out EasyJet. They'd quite like to have their bases in their presence in Switzerland. And if that were to happen, I could see, again, Lufthansa could take out someone like Wizz. It would give Lufthansa that kind of Eastern European market that they previously had with Austrian and Lufthansa before we emerged as Eastern Europe's largest carrier. So the tectonic plates are shifting, and as always, it's impossible to know what way they're going to kind of, how they will fall or align. But I would still be on balance of the view that in the next 5 years, once the state aid has to be repaid, Lufthansa probably finishes up acquiring or merging with SAS, Wizz, and probably Alitalia. Air France KLM probably will, I think, acquire EasyJet, and BA IAG will see TAP come into the fold. And then gradually, so you have 3, not unlike in North America, 3 high-fare, high-cost connecting carriers, and 1 very large low-fare airline, Ryanair in Europe, Southwest in the States.
Well, a good case study there in airline strategic planning from Michael O'Leary. We'll see whether Alex Cruz shares his views when we get to talk to Alex in a few minutes' time. Let's look at those network groups that Michael alluded to. They are in a very different position to what I talked about with the low-cost carriers who've largely been able to tap into growth opportunities. All 3 of them, Air France, KLM, Lufthansa and IAG, have shrunk in size during this pandemic, in particular because they've shed their largest aircraft, particularly 747 jumbos and the A380 double-decker aircraft, and replaced them with smaller twin-engined aircraft. That could have implications for their future size. We don't know how long. Secondly, we've already alluded to the fact they rely on premium cabin traffic significantly as a revenue and profit source. If that doesn't come back, that has not only implications for their total revenue earnings, but unless they change their cost bases or work harder to do so, it does beg questions about the sustainability of some of the network group's business models. So that's something to look at in the years ahead. As is the question of the role of hub airports. Are they going to be as important as they've been pre-pandemic? The Schiphols, the Charles de Gaulle's, the Heathrows, the Amsterdams. If these hub carriers, who are the major home carriers, are using smaller aircraft and need less feed, will there be less hub activity going on? Will different airlines come into these hubs? Will there be more attempts to bypass hubs altogether? And if we just touch briefly on the 3 major groups, well, IAG, the parent of British Airways and Iberia, it's been quite badly hit, perhaps more than the other 2 groups, because it's heavily exposed to the North Atlantic market, where particularly the UK and the US government restrictions, it's been unable to operate significantly for passengers until the last couple of months. It's certainly revised its long-haul fleet dramatically, with the large fleet of 747s coming out in the case of British Airways, which actually had the largest number of business class seats per aircraft of all aircraft in the fleet, and moving down to these large twin aircraft. Air France-KLM has faced a different situation in that it already had a government stake, both from the Dutch and the French governments. That stake, particularly on the French side, has been increased. They've talked even in the last few days about more of that government debt being changed into equity, which means more government influence, perhaps less commercial freedom for this airline group, as well as debt repayment for the future. They've nevertheless put very ambitious capacity growth plans out, but what I've seen so far is the demand they've seen has not met their growth. They've perhaps been over-optimistic. And then Lufthansa, which has also taken not only German government money, but money from other governments from states in which it has stakes in airlines, for example, Belgian with Brussels Airlines or Austrian. It's rapidly trying to pay that money back because the CEO there, Carsten Spohr, wants to bring back his commercial freedom, a bit like IAG, to get on the acquisitive scale of buying other airlines and to stamp the Lufthansa mark on a larger part of Europe. But so far, a bit like Air France-KLM, they've talked a very positive story about growth, believing demand will come back quickly, and particularly of business class travel. There's certainly not the evidence of that happening as quickly as Lufthansa would suggest. They have another financial report coming out this week, so we'll see if they're changing their tune at all. And the issue of government money coming in, well, of course, some airlines, you might always wonder why government money goes in time after time. And the one that I call the eternal phoenix in the industry, Alitalia, officially, Alitalia made its last flight only a week or so ago with a new iteration, phoenix-like, rising from the ashes, this airline, ITA. And I asked Michael O'Leary his thoughts on that.
How do you manage Alitalia on an ongoing basis as a standalone airline? It's on its 55th package of illegal state aid, massive loans. I think an Italian consumer agency produced a report in the last month saying that Alitalia burned its way through 13 billion of not state aid, but Etihad's money, Italian government money, Italian taxpayer money, airports money. They don't pay their bills. And, it's not sustainable. It can't continue. And I think politically. During the COVID crisis, I think the willingness of the Italian citizenry to keep bailing out a mess like Alitalia, or the Portuguese citizens are being asked to pay, 3 billion to TAP. But it carries 10 million passengers a year. The population is 10 million. 300 euros for man, woman, and child in Portugal is being wasted on bailing out TAP instead of being spent on hospitals and schools in Portugal. I think those days are over.
So let's watch this space with ITA. One more segment to mention is business startups. One thing that has been clear in this pandemic is the glut of aircraft, not only airlines grounding their fleets substantially, but a number deferring orders for new aircraft, returning aircraft from lease. There is not a shortage of either brand new aircraft or good quality used aircraft available around the world right now. That means there are more deals to be done with the manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, and indeed others such as Embraer, and with lease companies. And new startups have seized this chance to acquire aircraft at much lower rates than would have been imaginable even 2 years ago. If we look at the ones that touch Europe, that have started or are due to start, we have FlyPop, shortly to start in the UK-India market, a very substantial VFR market. Will they make that work? Up in Scandinavia and partly tapping into the challenges which Norwegian faced, we have Flia, mainly focusing domestically with some limited international ambitions. In Iceland, a new startup Play. Some of you may have seen an interview we had here with Skulli Mogensen from WOW, a previous long-haul low-cost airline in Iceland, which failed through overexpansion. Play aims to learn from the lessons of WOW and has already started its European flights. It will also enter the transatlantic market using Reykjavik's Keflavik Airport as a hub from next year. And then when Norwegian pulled back from a long-haul low-cost market as it faced financial challenges, which actually predated the pandemic, decided long-haul low-cost wouldn't work, lo and behold, a new airline is coming along, North Atlantic, with the same kind of aircraft that Norwegian flew. Indeed, some of them are probably literally the same aircraft from that fleet, but acquired at a much lower cost. And North Atlantic aims to make work what Norwegian couldn't do. So is it all about getting cheap aircraft? Is that going to make it work? Well, it takes more. At least these airlines theoretically have a clean sheet of paper. They have no history, no legacy, no baggage to have to deal with, no complicated staff agreements. They can start afresh. And what they could be doing, and hopefully they all will be, we'll certainly be asking Alex about this, is tapping into the digital technology that's available today, not only in interfaces with passengers and sales, but in running the business as a whole. But I couldn't not ask Michael what he thought about the chances of startups succeeding.
I think you will always have tiny niche airlines, you know, the Great Dane Airlines, which I'd never heard of, went bankrupt last week, you know. So there'll always be these small Mickey Mouse niche ones, but you know, is there going to be another Ryanair emerge out of Europe? No, and the reason for that is because Ryanair is everywhere in Europe now. There isn't a price point across the European continent under our €9.99 median fare or $14.99. You know, there will be people doing domestics or, you know, intra-Scandinavian stuff at €900 one way. You know, they'll be there for 6 months and disappear. The Norwegian model has always been fundamentally flawed. It never made any money, despite having efficient aircraft. They've proven that long-haul, low-cost doesn't fundamentally work or isn't going to be profitable. But really, in strategic structural terms, I think we're moving inexorably towards a North American type market where you have 3 or 4 large legacy airlines providing connecting services and Ryanair providing all the low-cost point-to-point efficient air access across Europe for the next, I don't know, 5 or 10 years.
So let's watch this space with the new startups. Last but not least, the environment. It's the real challenge that the industry faces, bigger than the pandemic itself, and this is one which is not going to go away with any relief from vaccines. We have COP26 meeting now in Glasgow as we speak. We're at 1 minute to midnight in the climate crisis, according to the UK's Prime Minister, and aviation is very much in the spotlight for what it's contributing to the problem and what is it going to do about it. Well, the industry body, IATA, AGM, a few weeks ago, has now committed the industry to achieving carbon net zero by 2050, which is obviously an admirable objective, but it needs to be achieved much more quickly. There is more work than perhaps many people realize going on in researching new engine technology and alternative power sources to fossil fuels, particularly in electric power and hydrogen. But sadly, the reality of these delivering anything meaningful is decades, not years away, not even through the 2030s in anything meaningful for the sector. And neither of these two power sources looks like it has any chance of delivering much to long-haul aircraft, which are the biggest contributor to carbon and non-carbon emissions in aviation's footprint around the world. So we have to work on sustainable aviation fuels to progressively replace as much of the fossil fuel kerosene that is used today. And there is not enough production capacity to do that right now. We need to work with governments to incentivize plants to produce more of these fuels, which I think will happen through the 2020s and the 2030s. It has to happen very quickly. It's the only way that progress can be made. And instead of the government taking an approach which generally is the case worldwide of beating the industry up with a stick and applying more taxes, we need much more of a carrot approach, a much more collaborative approach, so that aviation can play its part in the lifeblood, not only of tourism, but of human existence in the 21st century. Whether we see any more conciliatory and more collaborative words coming out of the COP26 meeting remains to be seen. Again, I had to ask Michael what his view was on this topic.
But I do think as an industry we need to turn the kind of, turn the kind of attention back on the politicians. Mm-hmm. You know, they're screwing the airlines and our passengers for egregious amounts of environmental taxation. Last year in pre-COVID, Ryanair paid 630 million in environmental taxes to governments all over Europe. Not 1 cent of that money was spent on the environment. You know, and then the governments come back and say, and now they want carbon offsets. Well, we're already paying you all this tax for your carbon offsets or environmental taxes. Spend that money on it. If European governments are really serious about it, the most significant thing European governments could do to reduce the impact of aviation on the environment is a single European sky, which is for 25, 30 years has gone nowhere. If we could eliminate all the air traffic control inefficiencies, strikes, failure of the French to show up every Saturday morning, you would reduce fuel consumption among the European airlines by between 10 and 20%. It would transform the environmental performance of airlines. But certainly, and I agree with your view, for the next 10 years, all we can do is invest in new technology. Ryanair's investing over 20 billion in new aircraft, which carry 4% more passengers but burn 16% less fuel. So we are doing our part. We're investing very heavily in new technology. I am somewhat more skeptical but about these kind of greenwashing projects like hydrogen and electric propulsion, because they're at least 20, if not 30 years away. They're not going to be here before 2030. So I think what we can really do then is sustainable aviation fuels, and governments must commit. It's government that has to deliver volumes of sustainable aviation fuels. Again, with my farming hat on, I'm slightly cynical about sustainable aviation fuels, because you get to a point where you're using kind of food supply, to generate alternative fuels, and all of a sudden you're driving up the cost of food for citizens and consumers, and that makes me feel somewhat uncomfortable. I mean, I think the most important thing we can do as an industry is invest in new technology, explain to our customer base that we're paying huge amounts of environmental taxes each year on their behalf. That should be used to offset our carbon output. But ultimately then, try to significantly improve the efficiency of our industry, which means getting rid of all these national air traffic control providers who screw up air travel for all European passengers and citizens. Move to a system like the States where air traffic control is managed across 2 or 3 centres, and you would significantly reduce flight times, you'd reduce flight delays, and you would massively reduce both fuel consumption and CO2 emissions as well.
Well, that's it from Michael for now. You can watch the whole interview online on the on-demand facility later. I'd now like to welcome to the floor our guest for today, Alex Cruz. Hopefully we're going to have time for a few questions from yourselves with the floor, if I can work this technologically advanced device, Slido. And I think for those of you watching online, you'll be able to ask questions as well. So Alex, welcome to WTM, not a stranger.
Great.
Can we just pick up where Michael left off there, Alex? First of all, the environment. I mean, it is the sort of the elephant in the room, and it's something you had to grapple with when you were running British Airways, well into being a serious issue at that point. How did you see that topic and the way to handle it when you were running BA?
Well, I think clearly over the last 3 or 4 years, it has become one of the biggest topics and areas of commitment for most airlines coming out of the recovery. I think there are 3 topics that are really important coming out of the recovery. One is the recovery itself. You've touched on many of those aspects. Certain is climate, and third is digital. I'm sure we'll talk about it. But from a climate perspective, I hear what Michael is a great proponent for pursuing certain lines of work, like politicians and taxes, and we all also lobby politicians and also try to change taxation regimes to be the right ones. But there's more that can be done. And I think that you will have seen airlines and companies like IAG and British Airways committing significant amounts of money, creating dedicated teams of people, looking at how to exploit, how to develop, how to design new ways to operate. Absolutely, we should go into single sky, European sky. We've been talking about this for many years. And we know that there is, I think, 15-16% improvement on fuel burn if that is solved. So there's definitely a prize there. But there's many other fronts. There's no single front to tackle the environment. There's multiple fronts. And I think that it's very, very difficult to find airlines today not being fully committed and trying to do as much as possible on this particular topic.
And what about politicians? Do you think we're going to get any reasonably minded politicians who do understand the value of airlines and aviation, or is it going to be a continuous beating up effort that we see in the years ahead?
As usual, I think it varies around the world. As you walk around WTM, you can sense the partnership between some countries and their home airlines. The airlines are part of the country project. Yes. And there you would expect a tremendous amount of support. When you go down to perhaps, maybe less so the US, but certainly Europe, that alignment is not there. So you would expect a lot of political activity, I suspect, not particularly supporting airlines. I wouldn't be expecting a huge change on that.
No. And Alex, moving back to the immediate challenge of a pandemic, I mean, I think we've got a unique opportunity to have you here today, because had you been even physically here a year ago, I think you would have been looking a lot more stressed, more furrows in your brow, because you were facing this challenge for real. Can you give us, and I'm not expecting you to breach any kind of a confidentiality, but you were there when all this began to hit with British Airways. And BA, as I was saying in the slides, it was one of the airlines who's hit most quickly and most severely. Can you give us, as far as you can, some kind of insight into those first few days and months? What was it like? Was it like a war room? How was the atmosphere day to day as this thing rolled on and proved itself to be bigger and bigger, and you didn't have a playbook to work out what to do?
Maybe one day I'll write a book. I mean, it's looking back to end of January, beginning of February of 2020, a succession of events took place. I remember the first time that we had some information about the situation in China, and I remember thinking, oh boy, we're going to have to cancel some flights to China, and not really realizing what was coming. And a few weeks later, more data coming in, eventually, if you remember, the first infection here in the UK, etc. And there was a pivotal moment when we basically decided to enact a new way, a new type of crisis committee. Whenever you go into a crisis, we have really well-written manuals that tell you what you do, who you do it with, what are the procedures, etc. In this particular instance, we decided that it was time to start really tracking everything very, very carefully every day. And from that second week in February until October, we met every single day. And as my wife likes to say, I didn't go to work on 4 Sundays because it was super important to make sure that we understood how every single tiny little detail of demand and of cost and of managing money and cash was taking place. It was extremely frantic at the beginning, very frustrating. In order to raise money, you need to do forecast. It was extremely difficult to do forecast at that time. But eventually, we managed to go and raise significant amounts of money, doing all kinds of things from, of course, sales and leasebacks, equity rights issues, selling art, if you remember, all kinds of things to really try to make sure that we would have enough money. 20 million pounds a day we were burning for many months. So it was a huge amount of money. And of course, there was the incredibly difficult transformation and adjustment of our workforce, which was done over a period of nearly 6 months. And it was incredibly difficult, mostly for those that were affected, undoubtedly. But it was very difficult. I spent a lot of time at the airport with the crews on literally hundreds of conference calls with unions, union leaders, etc. And at the end, we reached agreements, finally, on the 13th of August. But it was very torturous for absolutely everyone involved. So it was a difficult time, for sure. I am absolutely convinced that BA is probably in a prime position to succeed as soon as the traffic begins to get back to normal.
Well, I remember at the time, of course, there was a lot of challenging public relations issues with some of the unions not at all convinced of what you as management were saying. And arguably, they were successful in running a campaign, a BA betrayal, and it was all seemingly very negative, even some political traction. But I remember perhaps one of the most pivotal things was when you said we were going to retire our entire 747 fleet of 32, I think, aircraft just in one go, and they're not coming back. And I remember maybe a year or two before that, you saying it's going to be a sad day when we eventually say goodbye to these aircraft. It's an iconic plane. That was going to be 2025. I think suddenly you had to decide that there and then. Tell us about that decision, because as I mentioned again earlier, those aircraft were very much a big part of a North Atlantic operation, very large amounts of business class seats. Does that mean you'd made an assessment, this is not going to be a flash in the pan, this is going to be long term, we've got to take radical action beyond the day to day?
Look, there's nothing. I was talking to some airline colleagues this past summer, and we were, I shouldn't say joking, but talking about how much sleep the management teams of some airlines have had over this whole pandemic. And I told them that the management team of BA had very little sleep. There's nothing like not having a well-declared, very visible amount of government support to really motivate the airline to try to look for every single possible avenue for survival, which was the case a year and a half ago. So when we looked at how the pandemic could develop, and we were looking at more than 5 different official models to try to understand how this would evolve. What became really clear is that it would take many, many years before we could get back up to the levels of travel of 2019, certainly in terms of passengers. So we had an aging fleet of 747s. They were the ones that were most addressable at that particular time. We had newer aircraft, 787s, 350s, etc., which we could do some deals with lessors, etc., which we did at that time. But the 747 was an anticipated, a decision that was anticipated in time. It was sad in many respects, because we all love the aircraft, but it was the right decision to be made at that time, undoubtedly. From a labor perspective, I still vividly remember the conversation that I had with the head of the pilots union and with the head of Unite, who's no longer there, as you know, and having 2 completely answers. The pilots said, okay, we'd like to take a look at the data. We signed NDAs, we talked about it. And after nearly an hour of sharing this data, they said, okay, we need to work. And 4 weeks later, we had an agreement with the pilots. There was no noise with the pilots. Last year, it was a lot of hard work, and it was incredibly difficult, but it was good, constructive work. Unfortunately, the leader of Unite at that time said, no, you got to wait. The government is going to give you a lot of money. This was in February. And we said, we can't. We have to start a process. And that's where that turning point from the union and the opposition started. So ultimately, managing all those kinds of resources, it was complex. It was terrible to see the 747s. I tell you, it was significantly much more terrible to see a lot of people who left BA sooner than they really were planning to leave.
And leading on from that very personal experience of BA, the shape of the industry now in terms of the traffic, BA again is an airline that has really made its biggest margins from premium traffic in the long-haul arena. We've just talked about what happened with the 747 fleet. Now you can stand back from BA specifically and look at the industry generally and see how things have evolved. What is your take, Alex, on the mix of demand going forward between these different segments, leisure, visiting friends and relations, and this premium traffic? Is it just going to come back as some people would hope, or is it going to be significantly reshapen?
Well, it's interesting to see how we've seen airlines retire certain aircraft types, park certain aircraft types, but no single airline has announced a major reconfiguration of their cabins, which to me is a sign that most airlines are going to try to continue operating with their existing configurations. Now, in the case of long-haul traditional airlines like BA, Lufthansa, Air France, KLM, etc., they do have a lot of premium seats. Your analysis earlier touched on all the right points. The return to international business travel looks like it's going to be slow. Now, I am convinced it's going to return, and I keep on talking to corporates that talk about not wanting to lose deals to companies that go and visit their clients. So they will go and visit their clients whenever they're selling. And I also hear a lot of stories about people being promoted that have been to the office versus those that haven't been to the office, and how there will be also internal competition. So I suspect that business travel will come back in terms of demand. It will take some time. There is one constraint, though, and it's very real, and I think that we all have to acknowledge it, and it's the fact that corporations are also under scrutiny with regards to their ESG and climate credentials. And I have a strong suspicion, and I think there's already quite a bit of evidence, that a lot of companies are curtailing their travel, not so much because of COVID. COVID, yes, now tactical, it will be over. But later on the real questions will be not because of safety and security, but it will be, is it the responsible thing for you to go to New York and have that 1 hour meeting that we've always talked about, which is never really about just 1 hour meeting, it's something else going on. But so I suspect that business travel will come back, but slowly. Some areas more than others, shorter haul more than long haul. And I think what we're seeing is most airlines doing something that BA started doing many years ago, which is working the premium leisure market. And it's working with different fares, offers, working the frequent flyer program, etc., to try to make more leisure passengers spend a tiny bit or a little bit more money to travel on premium classes. So I suspect we will see quite a bit of that over the coming years. But there's still a challenge to fill those seats, undoubtedly, in many of those premium markets.
And what about Michael's analysis, his sort of textbook précis of the shape of the landscape between the low-cost carriers and between the network groups? I mean, particularly if we look at the three big low-cost carrier groups, we can see two are growing strongly. The third is not. It's even being seen as a takeover target. How do you think that might shape up in that part of the market here in Europe?
Well, Michael, first of all, runs a great business. He's a great businessman. He's also a good show. And some of the things that he says, we have been listening to for the last 20 years. In my mind, there are three types of airlines now, and I think you very well highlighted them earlier. Before, we have the legacy carriers, most of which, not BA, most of which have received a lot of help from their country governments. And they're not going anywhere. There may be some middle-sized ones and some smaller ones, maybe they won't make it. We've seen the Alitalia ITA transformation, but they're there, they will be there, they may be resized, transformed, they will be there. Then there is the Ryanairs and the Wizzes and the Spirits and the Asians, etc., which have, we now call them ultra low-cost carriers because their cost base really is really low. And by the way, it's not just the cost base itself, it's the fact that they have extremely low fixed costs as a percentage, which means that if they don't fly, they don't incur the variable cost, which is something that the traditional carriers don't have. Clearly, those two segments are there, they're confirmed, they're ready to go. We can talk about what may happen to them in the future. There's a new market, and there's a new segment, and there's the ones in the middle. The ones in the middle are very easy to define, are the ones that have a cost base that is in between the other two. So they're not ultra low-cost carriers, they're not low-cost carriers, they're not full legacy carriers, but they don't have access to the premium product. They don't have a proper business travel proposition, a premium travel proposition. And yes, you've mentioned one based here in the UK. And there's others around the world. And I think they are the ones that are more vulnerable at this particular point in time, because the avenues for survival and for remaining competitive are tougher than with the other two, without a doubt. So I think we have those three segments with different set of challenges for each.
And you mentioned about where government money has come in, and we see that in the other two big network groups in Europe. To me, the past few years, I would say Lufthansa and Air France-KLM seem to have had probably the best management they've ever had, very commercial leaders. But is there a risk of them being inhibited or maybe even a degree complacent because they've got so much government funding sloshing around, even though Lufthansa in particular seems to be trying to pay it down?
Look, there is a correlation between the degree of anxiety and angst and lack of certainty and the quality and the amount of effort that you make to survive. There's absolutely a correlation. That's why I was saying that I think BA is going to be in an incredible position because it really did not receive the sort of help that the others did. And as such, it did and is doing much more than the others to be prepared for the time of recovery. So I do think that there's a correlation between that. Having said that, the work continues. And I think everyone is banking on, first, passengers coming in, second, return or give back as much money that you've taken on loans, particularly from the government, and then look for ways to remain strategically important within your regions. I think we will see different approaches by all these big airline groups. Each one of them will have a different set of tools to be able to develop further.
And what about them running hubs? Because if we look at Heathrow right now, of course, there's a big fracas going on here in the UK. Heathrow wanted to put fees up by, if they have their way, 90%. Airlines, not surprisingly, don't want a penny or a euro cent more. Yet we see different airlines coming into an airport like Heathrow. Blue Air, which is a semi kind of low cost, certainly low price ticket airline coming in a high cost airport. Are we going to see those big hub airports change the dynamics with the hub role of those groups reducing, simply because they are going down to smaller aircraft?
No, I think it's a good question. And again, the hubs are different. Charles de Gaulle, Schiphol, Frankfurt, and Heathrow are different. The amount of slots available, it's beginning to come together to similar levels, but it's still slightly different. And the degree of interest to use those hubs, the consumer base in those home cities is completely different. So I suspect that different things are going to happen. For example, I'm quite puzzled as to what will happen on the 28th of March of next year when the winter season ends, and possibly there will not be slot relief at any of these airports. And I have a strong suspicion that we will see Heathrow full again. Now, which aircraft will be flying, which airlines, and how many passengers will be on those flights, I think we can use your IATA forecast to try to come up with an idea. When you look at the situation in Schiphol, I think is different. We are seeing some growth by some of the lower cost carriers there. Charles de Gaulle combined with Orly addressing the Paris market. I think the dynamics are going to be different. The ones that will be, I was going to say struggling, but that will be trying to define and design what the hub will be like will be those home airlines. So BA in Heathrow, Air France, KLM in their home hubs. And there it will be a lot of test and trial. One of the things that is happening at the moment is there's no data to go back to.
Exactly.
Normally, the way in which you do pricing is by using statistical data from the previous year and the previous years. There's no data to go to. And very, very, very few people, as far as I can tell, are beginning to use other sources of data. But if you're running a hub, yes, you will be looking at many other angles to try to figure out what should your capacity be and where you should put it.
Well, as you said, pricing is one aspect of the planning of where to fly and what kind of capacity, network planning. They've all had good, tried and tested sources of data. I must admit, when I was in those roles myself, I always used to draw the analogy with a financial investment when the small print would say the past is not necessarily a good indication of the future. And this has never been more the case for airlines. So
the only comment I was going to make is because we all recognize that the leisure market or segment is more resilient.
Yeah.
It's always been more resilient through our history. We should be expecting more leisure destinations from all of these hubs, including Heathrow. And we are. We have been for the last few months, and I suspect we will see more. We are seeing new long-haul destinations from London, new long-haul destinations from Paris and Frankfurt. I think that will continue because we know that airlines will try to tap into that particular leisure segment as much as possible.
And that's something BA was doing under your leadership already, wasn't it? Especially short haul, but as you say, you got into the pandemic, and I think routes like the Maldives, which I think we used to fly maybe once or twice a week, I think flying daily now on a 777, so big change in approach.
I mean, it made no sense to fly 6 times to Frankfurt every day in the summer. So it really just took a little bit of rejigging and put in some flights to leisure destinations in combination with Gatwick at that time to make sure that we have a very strong product. So I suspect a lot of that will be going on over the next few seasons.
And what about startups? I mean, I put a selection up there. You and I both know something about those companies. Are they going to get the right idea? I mean, in the past, if you'd got super cheap aircraft, you would have thought that perhaps would have been enough. But I don't think it is enough now. Anybody can get a cheap aircraft and anybody can lose money. Do you think these guys are going to get the right idea about what they do to go beyond just having cheap assets to actually make a sustainable business?
As you know, I've had a chance to interview a number of these, and it certainly looks challenging. I had an opportunity to start an airline from scratch in 2006 and build it. It was a lot of effort. We did have a market. We did have a cost base. But nowadays, a lot of people can achieve that cost base. So I think you mentioned one thing on the startup, which was the digital aspect. If these startups manage to grab a bigger share of our wallets, to have more awareness by reaching partnerships online, I don't know, they might be able to stay more relevant within the core markets. But it looks challenging. I am sure some of them will make it, and some others will see what happens.
But digital really is the core, isn't it? And I think now I haven't asked you what you've been doing in the past few months when you've maybe been more out of a public eye, but I do know, digital is something that you've always been interested in and very active in. I know you've become a board member on a number of startup companies. It has to be the key, doesn't it? And it's not just a sexy little app to keep the customers happy. It's about running the business, making decisions, evolving is everything.
Just like a lot of people used to call BA a pension fund with airplanes, the way that we used to make reference to Vueling, when I was in Vueling, it was a tech company that happened to have airplanes, because we knew that technology was enabling us to grow, enabling us to achieve everything that we achieved at that time, and Vueling has continued to achieve. So when I came into BA, I certainly tried to drive the technology agenda significantly, because I knew that it could help us, and it did help BA, and it will continue to help BA moving forward. But look, we found ourselves with two facts that we cannot contest. One of them is the majority of our customers have become more digital. Over the last 2 years, people have ordered more things online, they've bought more things online, they've been used to interacting with screens and taking the risk to actually purchase things, etc., and signing up to new services much more than ever before. And what they've done is they've experienced what good online digital experiences are like. If you've had a problem with Uber or Amazon, the customer recovery is fantastic. So that's problem number one for the airline industry. The second problem is, unfortunately, the systems that airlines run on are getting older and older. The newest systems are 18, 19 years old. The oldest systems are over 50 years old. And we have big airlines running on these systems. Those two things are taking us to a point where we know something is going to have to give. We have customers that want to have instant refunds. They want to be able to change classes. They want to be able to use their frequent flyer currency in very flexible ways. We're just not ready as an industry, not any particular company. The whole industry is just not ready to interact. We are an analog industry playing to be digital with digital customers. And on top of that, we get systems that really need to be changed. So the digital agenda is one that we're not discussing as openly right now, but it's tremendous.
Are there any airlines, even the LCCs, do they have this same exposure? Or are they maybe a bit better placed?
No. Michael is running on a system that is going to be 20 years old quite soon. So, no, there are very, very few airlines that are running on very new systems. They tend to be very, very small airlines. So this is a shared problem that the whole industry has, and a lot of work needs to happen. I think that the moment that Amazon begins to take money away from us, that then we don't spend going on a weekend to Paris or to Rome, I think maybe people will begin to wake up a little bit more. But in the meantime, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on digital.
Alex, I'm conscious we've got 3 minutes left. Anybody got a question from the audience in the 3 minutes remaining? Do you have a microphone? Where is it now? Just ask your question as quickly as you can so we get a good answer for you from Alex.
Hello. Hello, how are you? I'm Jose Antonio from Mexico. My question is, what do you think should be the limit from a government to be helping the airlines? Or it can be any time of help, any kind of help. And number two, what do you think about the countries that have not giving any money in this pandemic for their own airlines or their iconic airlines in their countries?
I wouldn't add much more to what I said before. Generally, I'm not in favor of government intervention. I think that the situation with the pandemic has been different, but at the same time, we do have a number of airlines that haven't received any special sector dedicated targeted help. They just use the standard mechanisms. I suspect those airlines are going to come out stronger. And even in your home country of Mexico, you will have seen tremendous differences between what is happening in Aeromexico and Volaris, and how Volaris is actually beginning to fly even more than it was in 2019 this past summer, whilst Aeromexico is still trying to find its own footing because it's older structures. It's like ultimately we need to let companies run their own models, try to innovate and try to become better and better. I do accept that help from governments has been very useful for many airlines around the world, and I won't take that away, of course. But I am quite curious to see if there will be a correlation between financial performance of those airlines 3 years from now, for example, and the ones that haven't received any money. I have a strong suspicion that the ones that didn't get any money will be in a significantly much better position to invest more on customers, to invest more in technology, to invest more on airplanes, and to invest more on sustainability, which is quite an interesting concept. Don't get money now, have money later to become an even better player.
Alex, thanks very much indeed. You've taken us up to 30 seconds before the end of our slot. Superb answering there. Thanks very much for your time today. Very interesting as always. Great to get those insights from BA and those forward-looking insights on the digital world we all face in the industry but are not yet truly adept and ready for. Alex Cruz, Airline Industry Leader and Director. Nice round of applause, please.
Thank you.
So that's it for this year's aviation session live. You can watch this, I think, again later on the streaming system, as will be the interview with Michael O'Leary. Tomorrow I'll be here to record an interview with Johan Lundgren from EasyJet, which will also go out on the virtual platform. Enjoy the rest of your day and this week at WTM. Thanks very much.